Hi everybody, I'm Bobby. Some people know me from DSM Tuners. I'm doing this video for YouTube and DSM Tuners. I'm going to be setting up the coilovers again. I say again because a while ago I already set the coilovers up and darn plane, and I've now changed a lot and it needs to be reset. So I originally did pictures of a write-up of how to do it, but this time I'm going to do a video because I wanted to do a video before but I never had time. Now this is the only thing I can do. It's more okay for me to do it with time constraints. I'm not as time limited rather. So what I'll be doing is running through the process. Most of it will apply to the front as well as the rear. I'm just doing the rear in this video, but I'll be applying the same principle to the front, so you won't have an issue with that. This setup, you have to use helper springs. You can use tender springs, but with the tenders they seem to be a bit more different setup because they tend to be a thicker poundage. So the helper springs are only 4 pounds on mine, and they're just mainly to keep the main spring in check once you get full droop or rebound rather. So they're not, you can push them up and squeeze them by your hand. It's not a super stiff spring, so setting up on this is a lot easier than if you go tender springs. You have to work out those rates and work them accordingly, but the general idea and setup should be pretty much identical to a point. So right, let's get on with this. It will be part video, part hyperlapse as I do this and take it apart, and then I'll nip in the talking side as what I'm doing. So yeah, let's flip this camera around and then I'll get to show you what it's doing. So this is what I'm working on. So at the moment, not very good light in there actually. So I'd already had this set up, so when I was running full compression I was about 5mm away from the top of the bodywork, and it was then sitting on the bump stop. This means that the wheel never really makes contact with the bodywork. It's the correct way to set this up. Right, now you've got your shock off, and that is the first thing you need to do. You'll notice that I have my helper springs, which, as I said, I can compress those. So all of this needs to come off, because what's going to happen, you've got to put the shock back on without the springs and without the dust cap. So you will want to be able to see the compression, and when it's hitting the bump stop on the car, you'll put it through its motion. So let me take this apart now, and then we'll get this back on and I'll run you through the sections it is. So as you saw there, let me get down on the ground. I took everything apart. I've got to tell you that when you do this, or if you're doing this, you always have to undo the tension of the spring, because if you don't and you undo the top, you could make that fly out. But because I had helper springs, which, as I said, are compressed by hand, these are already quite far out, so I had no preload on any of the spring at all. So it's safe for me to take it off when I know that that's a bit open. It's not going to make this a really strong piece, because this is a 14 kg spring, so it's quite stiff. if it was fully compressed like this, and I knew that when I took it off it's going to be possibly under tension or under preload, so you've got to make sure that it's not. Now most people won't have this. This is an optional extra I did. You'll only have your main spring, and most of the time this is under a bit of preload anyway, so that's just the safety side of stuff. As I said, you need to take the boot off because you'll want to just see the bump stop. You'll need to put the top back on, and when you take your adjuster off you'll want to set this into the full softest setting you can for the damper. Then you need to reset it up again. And the reason why you want it softer is so that when you push up the wheel you can actually push the shock down all the way. So that's why you want it to its softest setting. So now all I've got to do is install this back into the arm, into the shock position. Lightly mount it up. You don't need to torque anything up because you're only just putting it through its motions. Then you need to do your checks. So let's get that back on and then I'll run you through the rest of it. Right, so now that's on, you'll be able to, you want to make sure everything is nipped up nicely so that it doesn't have any movement. 1 millimeter of movement and floppiness isn't really going to be your ideal setup. So just nip everything up and then you're ready to put the wheel back on. Now, I'm going to walk you through this. You need to make sure that all of the collars, especially the bottom one, is loose, because this is the one that you're setting up at the moment, is the bottom one, not the tops. That's going to be your ride height from now on after you've set the bump up. So what you'll be doing, alright, I'm back, this time with a torch. Now it'll teach me to not bring a torch with me. So it's a little bit dark underneath here, but what you'll end up having is your shock with your bump stop on, and then you'll be hitting that up against the top section of your upper mount, and then as you do that, when you just touch the bump stop, your wheel will only be wanting to touch a little, or a tiniest little gap in between here, so you know that you're never going to foul out on here. That's the idea of this. So then that's how you set that up, and then this will, as I said, will be your ride height adjustment. It also means on a race car that you'll be able to do corner weighing easier, because this will be how you'll change the weight on your corners. So let's get the motion, the wheel on, and I'll run you through the motion and how we set that up. Right, this next step I'm not really going to be able to show you closely because you've got to get right up inside the rear of the wheel, knocking everything over. You've got to get right up inside the wheel, which is quite tricky and it's not something that I can really get a video of. So what you want to do is you'll be adjusting the actual shock housing itself into the lower mount, which is this section which connects to the knuckle, hub, whatever you call it. And the idea is you want to make sure that when the bump stop is touching the upper mount nicely and quite compressed and firm, that's when you know that you've got it set up decently. So you can have the tiniest little gap between the wheel or tyre and your fender, arch, flare, whatever you've got running on the car, so you know that you're not gonna constantly foul on here. So I'm just gonna do an adjustment. It should already be fairly close, but I'll see. It's going to be a little bit out since I've changed quite a few things. Before I do that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something. While you've got the spring out, you're able to find your full camber curve, or camber gain rather. Let's be precise on that, camber gain. So if you've got one of these, which is a Wixie, you've got different brands, angle finder, all you do is once it's on full droop, you can then put it on your brake disc, stick it to 0, and then if you've got one that lights up, this is the only one I got that lights up, my others don't, but it's okay because I can always read them. Then when you go under full compression, you'll be able to see your camber gain. So then all you do, once you've done this setup and you put your spring back on, you keep the camber gauge on it, you put the wheels back to the ground like it would be, set your ride height up, and then you subtract whatever the value is from here back to what you already found under full compression, and that's your camber gain through that complete motion. So if you have 1 inch of travel and you're running quite stiff shocks, quite stiff springs, and you're gaining 1 degree, that means under static to 1 inch you're running 1 degree camber gain. So then you can use that as your data as well. It's not always the most accurate way to do it, but it's going to give you a darn sight good indication. The other way to do it is when you do a bump steer test. If you're doing a bump steer test, you've got more stuff openly, and you can put again a angle finder on that or the actual brake disc, run it through its motion, and then you'll be able to see the camber gain then as well, because most of the time on a bump steer kit you're actually setting the wheel to the actual ride height and then running it through the motions as it would be seeing up and down, not just fully down. So yeah, that's just another little tip which I'd used before. I don't use it that way now because I always do that when I do a bump steer setup. I always find my camber gains and camber losses through the actual motions. So let's get this set up, and I'm going to do this adjustment and then go from there. That's all done. It only took me a good couple of minutes to get it right. You want to make sure that your bump stop up the top is quite compressed nicely. Some bump stops are quite soft, some are really hard. If you've got like a medium firmness, you want to make sure it's trying to squash enough so that you're actually using as much of the bump stop as possible before you can bottom out. So what I've done now, if I pump this up, so it starts to get stiff now, and I can just fit my fingers through it, and then it starts to get really stiff, so I know I'm on my bump stop. If I get up, and then now I've got probably a good 3-4 mil of gap in between here, so I can see actually through the wheel area. I can't fit my finger in it anymore, but I can see through, which means that the bump stop is now being used quite a bit, and this is the maximum you're probably going to go. Most of it won't ever hit here anyway, because as I said, the shock and springs on race cars are normally pretty stiff and very set up quite high on the valving. So now that's done, all I've got to do is lock the bottom collar, put the spring back on, then I will leave the bottom spring collar loosened, and then I get to mount the I get to set the ride height up. Now that you've done this side, in theory, and I have done this before and it's worked, so I say in theory, you should be able to transfer this data over to the other wheel, but not to the front. You can only do axle sets, so rear to rear and then front set to front. What you'll do for that is you've got your lower spring perch, you'll take a datum from that lower spring perch, you'll take a datum from your upper spring perch, which is constant, it's never moving. You'll measure between the two. Once it's locked in place, you'll transfer that to the other side of that axle, and then those will be equal left to right. All that will be different and will differ from left to right on the rear axle is your spring height. That's obviously because you got driver, you got weight differences, you got fuel, you got batteries, you got everything else in the car. So that will set your ride height on your upper spring perch only and your corner weights. So let's get this dismantled again. I'll get it put back together, and then I can transfer it to the other side and go from there. Right, now I've got the shock back off. The lower adjustment spring perch, or not spring perch, the lower adjustment locking tab can be locked off. That is never going to get changed again. Now you've set it up for the car. So just lightly nip it. It's probably best to actually do this on the car, because then nothing will be moving. But once you've locked it on the car, you'll be fine with that. The next step is to take the top back off, put the spring back on with the dust cover, and then mount this back all together and tighten the top nut up. So you'll be putting your cover back on because you don't need to see the bump stop anymore. Then you'll be putting your lower or your main spring, then you'll be putting your tender spring, your upper radial mount if you've got one, and then your jam nut. Give that a little knock to lock it in. can put your valving adjuster back on, because that doesn't need to be off anymore. Nip that up, make sure it goes through all the motions on your valving twist, and then set it back to full soft again. So the spring perch collars, they're going to be, as I was saying, your ride height adjuster, and they'll also be your setup for the corner weights. So this is all you're ever going to be changing again, ever again. You'll never be touching this unless you change things like wheel sizes. Tire sizes can be a problem because the overall diameter can alter. So while I'm basing this off of a street tire, my racing tires are actually slightly thinner, even though they're wider. I don't know why, but they just tend to be a little bit. I think it's because there's not as much tread on there either. So while I've based it off of that, I've given myself about 4mm leeway, so it's not too bad, but it shouldn't be a problem. So ideally what I should have said at the start, make sure you use the wheels you're most likely going to be using as your biggest set you will be using. Then you know if you go smaller, you've got much more clearance on the whole setup. The other thing I've got to mention as well is on the bottom shock shaft, you've got to make sure that you leave enough threaded in the lower housing. You don't want to be up here because you will possibly snap or break something. So you need a good amount of thread left in the lower shock body. Other than that, it's just a simple case of reinstall this, put it back to, or transfer the data to the other side, put it on the ground, do your ride heights using this, and then you'll be able to get a wheel alignment after, because you will probably need one. And if you're going to go the next step after this, which is what I have to do, I'll be setting this up, then I'll be redoing bump steer setup, because on the rear I have a bump steer set, so I'll be readjusting that, then doing another alignment, and then hopefully that's all me set up. Well, that's the end of all of this video. I hope you liked it. Once you've done all this, just make sure you go through all of the bolts that you've taken off, make sure you've re-torqued everything, double checked all the bolts to make sure you have torqued everything, because the last thing you want to do is to have something come off, and obviously I don't want to be responsible for you forgetting to do something up. So with that said, I'm just going to button all of this up. I'm going to go and do the other side, then I'm going to go and do the front. The front's a little bit more trickier, just a bit tighter. Other than that, I hope this has helped you understand the correct way of setting a coilover up, and if you have any questions, do feel free to leave a comment below, and I will be able to help you or assist you further. If you did like this video, I'm going to try and start doing some more how-to videos as well. I've got some, but it's mainly just for the Eclipse, little problem, small setups, but I will try and do some more in the future. So if you do want to keep up to date, just do what everyone else does, you know, subscribe and press that ding dong button, and just keep an eye out for some videos. Thank you very much. Take care.